the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation.
A very important
From the Israel Institute of New Zealand.
which come from Jerusalem.
Hi, I'm Ashley Church from the Israel Institute of New Zealand. I'm here with Dr. David Cumin, Fellow Director of the Institute, and this is the Israel Report. And a fascinating topic this week, David. You've just recently had a debate, discussion, whatever word you want to use to describe it, with John Minto. And John Minto is a name that will be familiar to many Kiwis. John Minto was a campaigner against apartheid in South Africa in the 80s. He was involved in the protests that took place during the Springbok rugby tour. And in that guise, he became somebody who was loved by some Kiwis and despised by others because of what he did with regard to our other religion, of course, which is rugby. But he's been involved he's transitioned himself into a role as being a campaigner effectively against Israel over the last few years. And he's drawn an inference that there is a connection between the work that he did on behalf of the apartheid movement in the 80s and what he's now doing against Israel. And so this debate took place on what date?
It was October 3rd.
October 3rd at Auckland University, well attended. The auditorium was completely full, and he took the side of the anti-Israel rhetoric, and you defended Israel extremely well, might I say.
Thanks.
And so what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss particularly two portions of that debate, two parts of the address that John Minto himself made. And we're going to discuss those and the accuracy of those comments and what they actually mean. But we would encourage people at some stage to actually go through and watch both of the addresses, both from Minto and from yourself, and they'll be available on the website. But
yeah, they're up already. And I think it's important, before we get into the clips and any of the discussion, it's important to understand how this came about.
Great.
John Minto lives in Christchurch. He was standing for Christchurch Mayor. And there are a number of other people that are associated with his new anti-Israel group in New Zealand who also live in Christchurch. And they were writing a number of letters to the editor in the press, the local paper in Christchurch, and getting them in that were not entirely correct, anti-Israel letters. And we noticed this as the Institute, and we decided to write a little bit of balance into the letters. And so we submitted a letter saying, Israel is not an apartheid country. There are equal rights for all the citizens. There's a free and open press and an independent judiciary. And here's some facts to balance out.
And he responded to those letters also through the press?
Also through the press, and said, well, if you think the situation is so complex, why don't we have a public debate about it? Mm-hmm. And then there was the decision, do you give air to some of his views by having the discussion?
Which I thought was very brave.
Or do you say, no, thank you very much, we'll leave it at that? And I think the right thing to do is to try and expose his lies and their perceptions, and to provide a balancing view.
It's interesting. I mean, I remember when we talked at the time before the debate took place, and I suppose my sort of conservative, instinctive view was to say, look, just, there's other things that we can focus on that are more important, and this is a fringe element within, the community. Let's just leave it alone. But I think ultimately, once that debate took place, I think I appreciated what you did and why you did it. So I think I've sort of come around to thinking, yep, that was exactly the right thing to do.
Yeah, well, and I think as we'll see in the clips, there's, and these are only small parts of his entire speech, which we're also planning on going through and showing what's wrong on our website. Yeah. But I think people will quickly understand that, if you give people enough rope, they'll hang themselves.
So on that note, let's start with one of those. So we're going to watch one of those clips now. So let's have a look at that clip first.
The situation in Palestine is very straightforward. In a word, it's colonisation. The movement of Jewish people from around the world to take over Palestine, to displace and subjugate the existing indigenous Palestinian population. And some of that existing indigenous Palestinian population were Jewish. Theodor Herzl, often referred to as the father of Zionism, and Zionism here I mean the belief in the need for a separate Jewish state, described it as a colonial idea. And he said it'll be easier to convince the English of this because the English have been setting up colonies all around the world, including this one here in this country, in New Zealand.
So that's interesting. And he uses the word colonisation. Now, David, I've got some pretty strong views on this. So colonisation, the dictionary definition of colonisation is a reference to the establishing of a base or an outpost of a larger civilization. And so there's lots of examples of that through European history. The one that's probably most familiar to us here in New Zealand is the British Empire, which set up colonies right throughout the world. And in each of those cases, It was an outpost, if you like, a smaller version, a cloned version of what was a larger civilization based in the UK, based in London. New Zealand had become a colony of the United Kingdom. So that definition is very clear in respect of what colonisation actually is. If you apply that to Israel, exactly what civilization or empire was it that was establishing Israel? From what were the Jewish people coming in order to establish a colony in Israel? It's a nonsense term. It simply has no validity. You could, if you wanted to be an extremist, you might use the word occupier or invader. You cannot use the word colonisation. It simply has no meaning in that context, and therefore it's wrong.
Well, absolutely. And Mr. Minto almost acknowledged that when he said that Jews were also indigenous. Right. A little bit in that clip where he kind of skirted around the idea of indigeneity as being the Palestinian Jews, which we could talk about for a whole other episode. But at the end of the debate, if people are watching that, he said clearly that of course Jews are indigenous to Israel. Now, you tell me any other indigenous people that has colonised their ancestral lands. It makes no sense.
Now that's important because he uses that word in the debate, but it's actually a word that's found its way into the lexicon in a number of different places over the last 2 or 3 years. So if you go online and look at the debate, the sort of the anti-Israel, anti-Jewish rhetoric, it continues to use this word colonisation as quite a powerful trigger word in order to impact people's beliefs on this.
Well, it's a very emotive term.
It is a very emotive term.
Today, especially in 2019, we associate it with all sorts of terrible things that foreigners have done to indigenous populations. And so it's a very emotive word, and it's become a trope. It's become an ongoing kind of trope like the word apartheid or the word genocide. And these words have very strong emotive meanings that are designed to delegitimize and undermine the state of Israel.
Now, I think we should probably acknowledge, he references in his debate, and I think that Herzl actually used that word as part of the Zionist movement prior to the establishment of Israel. And my understanding is that's correct. But I think it's important to understand the context and the time in which that phrase was being used.
Yeah, well, we don't know whether he thought it was actually a colonial enterprise, in which case he was wrong.
Right.
Or he was thinking that he might be able to persuade the British by using language that they understood in order to drive forward the idea of a homeland for Jews in their indigenous lands.
Yep.
So I'm not sure why it was, but obviously when you have a quote like that, it's good to bring it out from John Minto's perspective because here we have a Zionist saying that it was colonial, therefore it is. But actually, like you say, the definition, the whole idea of indigenous people colonising their lands is just ridiculous.
Plus, to be fair, there had to be something in what Minto said that was correct, and why not a quote from Herzl?
Well,
so.
but I think even if you get beyond the words and the emotive language and the falseness of that, the next bit that he goes on to say is that Jews came to subjugate and take over and control these other people when nothing could be further from the truth.
Yep.
All of the documentation at the time, from Herzl to Ben Gurion, all the way through has always said, no matter what happens, all people will be treated equally. And that is what we have in Israel today. All citizens are treated equally under the law.
Yep.
There are disparities and the government tries to address those, but under the law, there's no sort of subjugation or second-class citizenship.
No.
It's not how it is under the law.
No, great language, but completely wrong.
Well, that's it. And I think it's important that people understand that because the things that Mr. Minto is saying are said on social media, they're said even by some politicians, and all of the anti-Israel activists use the similar language and they repeat the lies.
Yep.
And if a lie is repeated often enough and not counted, unfortunately, people start to believe it.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Let's move on to the second video and we'll watch that now.
Every day since 1948, Palestinians have had more land stolen, more houses bulldozed, more civilians harassed, attacked and killed, and more Palestinian children murdered with absolute impunity whenever Palestinians have resisted. Somehow Palestinians are not supposed to resist. This would be the same as if we said to France was occupied by Germany in the Second World War. Do we tell the French resistance, don't fight against German occupation of your country? Of course we don't. We applaud the resistance of the French against German occupation of their country. Some of us do.
Wow. Lot to unpack there. There's a lot of emotive language, lots of claims. Where do you start?
Yeah, well, where do you start? And we're going to put up a Fisked version of his speech on our website. So I encourage people to check israelinstitute.nz to keep up with that, and it'll come out soon. But I think in that clip, there are three issues really to unpack primarily. The first one is this idea of every day there's land being taken away from the poor Palestinians, and that's not right. So even if you think about the settlement blocks, they haven't really expanded in land area for decades now. They're building up, not out, and they only make up 2% of Judea and Samaria or the West Bank. So even that claim is not quite right. But the underlying premise, of course, that Mr. Minto wants you to take away is all of the land belongs to the Palestinians. And that's the nub and the heart of the problem, is that there are two competing claims to the same area of land, and where the Jews have been willing to compromise give up land for peace, say yes to a two-state solution, say yes to partition at various times, multiple times. The Arabs have always said no. They've rejected it every single time. And that classic quote, the Arabs have always missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
So that whole claim, of course, is not a legal claim; it's a political claim.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we can get into legalities and another whole discussion around that. But there are great legal claims that the land belongs to the Jews. The entire land, actually, and the compromises that the Jews have been willing to make are being for peace. So that's the first bit out of that clip. The second part is really disturbing. This whole idea that Israel or the IDF murders children is just an abhorrent, disgusting trope. And it's no different to in the Middle Ages when organizations and people were saying that Jews murder babies to drink their blood or use their blood in rituals. It's a blood libel. And those blood libels throughout time have been used as incitement to have pogroms against Jews, to have massacres against Jews. And this is no different. This is saying...
Modern day equivalent.
It is exactly the modern day equivalent of a blood libel. Saying the IDF murders children is just abhorrent, not only because of the historical inferences, but because it's false. It's completely false. There's no other army in the world that has done more to protect civilian lives on both sides than the IDF in similar circumstances. And Alan Dershowitz, the famous Harvard professor, has issued the challenge to all of his audiences that if you can name one other country that has done as much to protect civilian lives in the same circumstances, he will give you $1 million. There is none. No one's been able to meet that challenge. That's the second thing. And I think the third part of what Mr. Minto was saying there, the Palestinians are resisting the occupation. And what he's meaning there, and I think it's clear to everyone, is that the terrorism that the Palestinians commit, whether it be the stabbing of a yeshiva student who's just returned from buying a gift for his rabbi in Judea and Samaria, or the bomb attack that left an 18-year-old girl murdered and her father and brother injured in an attack, or the Intifada that had thousands of people murdered and injured in suicide bombings on buses and in cafes. That's resistance in the eyes of Mr. Minto, and that's legitimate because they're resisting, just like the French were, which is it's abhorrent.
It's a slippery slope of an argument because the actions of one side are always characterised as being bad and wrong and aggressive, and the acts of the other side are always characterised as being justified and reasonable. So you can't win an argument like that because there's no objective basis upon which to actually approach the issue. So David, I just want to finish by saying I just want to remind our viewers that we've got both of those videos on our website, that they can go and access them. I would encourage people to watch both right through because I think it's important that we sort of see both sides. And then we look at some of the other material obviously that's on our excellent website that talks about these issues.
Yeah, so israelinstitute.nz, the whole of my speech, the whole of Mr. Minto's speech, and there's a link to the entire event that was live streamed as well. So check it out, see everything in context, and think about what both of us are saying.
Great. And so just thank you again for taking part. As I say, I wasn't sure that was the right move, but now that you've done it and I came along and watched, it was a fantastic event. It was a great endorsement of the position that we continue to uphold at the Israel Institute, and a credit to you for actually putting yourself on the line and doing that. So well done.
Thank you. And I just want to say to everyone that came along, the room was packed, as you said. Standing room, there were people behind the screen. We had to move the aisles. It was so wonderful because there were a lot of friendly faces in the audience, and that made a huge difference to me. So thank you for coming along, if you came along. I don't intend on doing something again like that for a little while, but when we do and if we do, come along as well. Thank you.
And that was the Israel Report for this week.
The Hague Initiative for International Cooperation.
A very important
Almost every language, the Israel Institute of New Zealand.
My roots come from Jerusalem.